Welcome to the tutorial on conducting interviews with experts and explaining their expertise to your readers. This tutorial will discuss some important tips for successfully interviewing experts, as well as how you can quickly but effectively explain someone's expertise to your readers. The first thing that you should do when you meet anyone, including an expert, for an interview, is introduce yourself. Explain that you are a journalist who is investigating a topic and that you want this person's insight into the situation. Also, explain that you have a deadline and explain what aspect of the story you plan to focus on in your publication. In order to get the person to talk to you, you will need to be sociable. Creating an inviting atmosphere for a conversation and encouraging the expert to talk are imperative skills that journalists must develop. If you can do that, then your interviewee will talk openly with you and give you a lot of information. Throughout the interview, you will want to make sure that you stay in control of the conversation and the equipment. For example, be sure to lead the direction the interview goes in, be the one asking the questions instead of answering them, and stay in control of the microphone. These may sound like simple things, but when you have an interviewee who wants to vent or who wants to start grabbing your recording equipment, you need to draw the line. Refocus the expert on the specific question you asked. Let him know that you need to hold on to the equipment to ensure it's utilized properly, etc. In that way, you can maintain control of the interview while still being respectful of your interviewee. As with any other interview you conduct, you need to ensure that you are listening actively to everything the expert says. Don't worry so much about your list of prepared questions. Start by asking the expert your first question, but then listen carefully to his answer and ask some follow-up questions to see where the conversation goes. Sometimes you will find you have inadvertently asked some of the questions on your list. Other times, you will find that you have sparked an eye-opening conversation that got you a lot more information than you would have received if you had just asked the questions that were on your prepared list. When the conversation wanes or you cannot think of an appropriate follow-up question, then reference a list of questions you have prepared for your expert and ask one of those. Keep doing this until you have worked your way through each piece of the conversation and each question on your list. When you are organizing your list of questions, start the list with the easiest questions. Let the expert get used to talking with you and giving you detailed answers. Let him lower his guard. Then work your way up to difficult questions. That way, you will get lots of information out of him before you potentially sour the conversation with difficult questions. Plus, you will be more likely to get a straight answer from him on the difficult questions if he is already used to giving you straight answers on the easy questions. If you are struggling with what types of questions you should ask the expert, then consider the following. You can ask him to explain what makes him an expert. That'll help you to understand his background and his potential biases, as well as confirm for you that your source really is deserving of expert status. You can also ask your interviewee to break down a situation for you step by step. We see this all the time in sports broadcasts, where a play or a move is broken down in detail for the audience. Additionally, you can ask the expert to define any key technical terms that you might not know the definitions of, or that you might not understand, or simply might not know how to describe to your audience. Often, experts are great at rephrasing technical concepts in layman's terms, or at least giving simple examples of the concepts. Of course, you can also ask an expert for his opinion on a controversial situation, or ask him to explain why contradictory opinions exist on a subject. That will help your readers to see both sides of the story and to gain an informed perspective about each side. In general, you just want to ensure that your questions utilize the expert's experiences and opinions. Since you can look up basic definitions and facts yourself, you do not need an expert to tell you those things. Instead, you want to interview the expert to get his professional opinion on relevant hypotheticals about what might happen in the near future, how a situation relates to past events, or what his analysis is of a current situation. You also want to ask him questions that are simple and straightforward. That means you will only ask one question at a time. Instead of asking compound questions like, "How are you and did you have a good day?" That way, the interviewee will not get confused about which part of your question to answer and will be able to focus on giving you a detailed and helpful answer for the one question you asked. It can be advantageous to acknowledge the interviewee's status as an expert within the question as well. That way, you can direct the interviewee regarding what aspect of his experience you want him to focus on when he answers the question. For example, if you're interviewing Arnold Schwarzenegger, then you may phrase the question as, "Given your experience as California governor, what do you think about the state's economy?" That way, Arnold will know from the beginning of your question that you are talking about politics and not expecting him to draw on his experience as a bodybuilder when answering this question. On another note, asking insightful questions will help your readers to feel like you made the most of your interview with the expert. Don't be afraid to challenge assumptions when you converse with someone. You can ask the interviewee what common assumptions in the field are and whether he agrees with those assumptions. You can also challenge the assumptions surrounding the person you're interviewing by keeping an open mind throughout your conversation and asking questions that relate to the topic. Don't be afraid to ask unique and challenging questions of your expert. One thing to watch out for is asking too many questions that would allow the expert to go off on tangents or start rambling about his opinion. You want to direct the questions towards specific answers so that the interviewee does not digress off the topic too much. You also need to get comfortable cutting off anyone who is rambling by politely asking him to refocus on the precise question you asked. No matter who you're interviewing, you need to pay attention to both the body language you're using and the body language your interviewee is using. It will be important to ensure that your body language matches what you're saying and the tone of your voice. It will also be important to use your body language to show your interviewee that you are fully engaged in the conversation you're having with him. Similarly, paying attention to your interviewee's body language will be helpful in determining whether he's comfortable talking with you, fully believes what he's telling you, or is truly knowledgeable about the subject matter. You should also use expressive gestures to reiterate what you're saying during the interview and make the interviewee feel like you are completely engaged in the conversation or topic. Additionally, maintaining eye contact with the interviewee, if doing so is culturally appropriate given the interviewee's cultural background, will be helpful in showing your engagement in the conversation. Positioning each of you close together, but in a manner that does not intrude on each other's personal space, will also add to the comfort level you each have during the interview. The more comfortable you and your interviewee are, the more the conversation will flow, and therefore, the more helpful information you will receive. Throughout your interview, you will need to critically analyze everything the expert is telling you and compare it to all the research you have conducted on the topic. That way, you can ask the expert about any contradictory information, any gaps in your mind about the subject, or any other issues that may pop up. You will also need to ask the interviewee lots of questions that allow you to get an objective perspective on the topic. For example, asking an expert not only about his opinion of a situation, but also about the valid elements of the opposing perspective of the situation will be helpful for showing you the merits of both sides' arguments. On a more emotional note, it's important to empathize with your interviewee. Empathizing means showing that you understand the interviewee's feelings. This can be a helpful tool for reporters to utilize because people often want to elaborate on their stories if they feel like their audience empathizes with them or understands their situation. As a result, reporters can get a lot of information out of someone who is normally quiet if they just empathize with that person a few times throughout the interview process. Another technique reporters often use to their advantage is being silent. If you are silent and the interviewee is uncomfortable with the silence, then he'll likely speak just to stop the silence. As a result, he's likely to say something without thinking about whether he should be saying it, and therefore is likely to give you information you otherwise would not have received during your interview. Paying attention to the tone of voice the expert uses is also important because it, like body language, can tell you whether the expert is confident in what he is saying, whether he feels comfortable with the interview process, or even whether he's passionate about a particular topic. Overall, there are a few keys to every interview. First, don't be afraid to ask for a break if you need it or if you think the interviewee needs it. You're in control of the interview process, including whether a break is taken. So don't be scared to ask for a break or ask an interviewee not to take a break just yet. Second, always feel free to ask your interviewee to speak slowly if you're having trouble understanding him, especially if you're interviewing someone who has a heavy accent or just someone who's overly excited about the topic of the interview and speaking quickly. You may have trouble understanding what's said. Since the whole point of the interview is to communicate the interviewee's opinions to you so that you can accurately report them, don't hesitate to ask the interviewee to slow his speech in order for you to fully understand what he's saying. If you're unable to finish your interview in the allotted period, then ask the interviewee for a second interview. Tell him that you want to follow up with him on some of the information he gave you during this interview and ask when he's available for a follow-up interview. Also, keep in mind that interviews do not just have to be verbal. They can include visual aids as well. You may find that having your expert draw out a picture, a diagram, or a map helps to communicate an idea effectively to you. If that's the case, then do it. After all, the whole point of the interview is to get that information communicated from one person to another. So whatever helps you to accomplish this goal is a good thing. On occasion, you will find that an interviewee, particularly an expert interviewee, comes into the interview with a bad attitude. If that's the case, then here are a few tips for handling the negativity. If you have an interviewee who is deceitful and lying to you, then explain to him the data you have already collected and ask him to clarify the contradiction between the data and what he has said. You can also ask him the question again later in the interview by putting it in a slightly different context or rephrasing it a bit to see if he gives you a truthful answer then. If you have an interviewee who's egotistical, then acknowledge his high status as an expert and bite your tongue about how annoying his ego is. Often you'll find that just acknowledging the person's expertise shows him that you understand what he's accomplished and makes him stop acting so egotistically. You can also use positive reinforcement by asking questions that consistently reference his experiences, publications, or accolades so that he feels like his ego is being stroked. If you have an interviewee who's condescending, then be sure to thank him for his time. Explain to him that you realize his time is valuable and you really appreciate the fact that he is using that precious time to help you and your readers understand certain concepts. Again, here you may find yourself biting your tongue a bit when conducting the interview so that you don't retaliate with a negative attitude of your own. However, you can vent to your editor, close friends, or colleagues after the interview is over. Just be sure to make the most of your time during the interview itself. Nowadays, a lot of interviews are conducted via email. If you wind up interviewing an expert via email, then keep the following tips in mind. First, you will want to include a specific subject line in your message that lets the expert know exactly what the interview is for and that it's an email interview. For example, a subject line like interview questions on Hillary's chances of getting elected in 2016 is specific and effective. Second, include an introduction in your email where you explain the basic idea of your story to the expert, but keep this introduction short. The expert wants to get to the point of the interview quickly, whether it's an in-person or an email interview. Third, ensure that your questions are phrased as clearly as humanly possible when you're interviewing someone via email. Go through your questions in detail before you send the email to make sure that they are explicit about the kind of information you're requesting from the expert. If there are any ambiguous phrases or questions, then make sure the questions themselves include examples of the kind of information you're looking for. Also, make sure that your questions are focused and straightforward, since that will help to eliminate any confusion. Arranging your questions in a logical order will help guide the expert through your email interview effectively and quickly. In your email's conclusion, be sure to let the expert know when you need the answers to those questions by, given your deadline for the publication. Also, send him a courtesy email the day before you need his answers, just to remind him that the deadline is approaching. Most importantly, plan ahead. Let the expert know that your deadline is, let's say, Friday at 5 p.m., even if it's not till Sunday at midnight. That way, if the expert is late with his responses to your questions, you will still have time to meet your publication deadline. Then on Saturday, you can email him a reminder and explain in a polite manner how important it is that you receive the answers to your questions ASAP. Whether your interview is conducted in person or via email, you always want to conclude it by summarizing the key points you learned from your interviewee. This way, you will not only show your expert what you learned from him, but you will also be able to double check that you are focusing on the things the expert thinks are important. That way, you can double check that you are focusing on the right things in your article and conveying the most valuable information to your readers. It is also helpful after summarizing the interview to ask the expert if there is anything else he wants to tell you or if you're missing anything. Doing this will allow you to cover all of your bases and ensure that you're getting all the important information out of your source. Finally, be sure to thank the expert for his time and do so sincerely. Then go home and review your notes so that you can make sense of them. If you don't review your notes quickly after an expert interview that includes a lot of technical jargon, then you're unlikely to be able to coherently interpret your notes later when it's time to actually write your publication. This will also help you to identify if there are any gaps in your research that you need to quickly follow up with your interviewee about or do additional research into. When you sit down to finally write that publication and use the quotes from your expert source, be sure to explain to your readers that you took the time to interview someone who is truly an expert. The best way to do this is to include a short phrase before you first quote the expert. That phrase should explain what makes the person a reliable and authoritative source on the subject. For example, you could write something like, John Doe, a tenured professor of economics at Georgetown University, to show your readers that John Doe not only teaches at a reputable university, but also has tenure there, which implies he's been an excellent teacher on the topic of economics for many years. You can also show your readers evidence of your source's expertise by hyperlinking to relevant biographies, publications, or lists of accolades the expert has received. These things may be listed on your interviewee's LinkedIn profile, or there may be websites for the awards he has received. Either way, hyperlinking to those things as you mention them in reference to your interviewee will help your readers to understand why they should take your expert's opinion seriously and trust the information you're reporting. With time and practice, you'll get used to interviewing experts, and explaining people's expertise will truly become an automatic part of your writing style. Thanks so much for listening, and good luck interviewing your expert sources.